All right, we're going to be talking about the part 3 here of section 4.5. So we've already talked about finding the amplitude and the period, and then we did a vertical shift, and now we're going to throw in a phase shift here. So phase shift is basically going to kind of not start at 0 and end at some point. It's going to have a differing starting point as opposed to 0 degrees, 0 radians. So it might start at negative 90 degrees or positive pi over 4, as we're going to see. So just a little bit of a reminder, these are the general equations. Remember, A changes what the amplitude is. And again, amplitude is the distance from your midline to the high values and the midline to the low values. B affects how fast your graph repeats. And so that's talking about 360 divided by B or 2 pi divided by B. Out here, we talked about a vertical D that moves it up and down, just like an x squared versus an x squared, and then a plus 5 would move it up 5. And then C now is going to change it. So here's the little kind of quote-unquote formula for phase shift. It's the opposite of C divided by B. So you change the sign of B, C, and then divide it by your B value. The biggest mistake people make more than likely is they forget to do negative C divided by B. They just do C divided by B. So that changes your starting points. Like your phase shift for us is going to be where we start. Now, technically speaking, sine and cosine graphs just keep on repeating both left and right. So we don't have officially a starting point, but we're going to graph one cycle of these like always. So we're going to call it the starting and ending point. Okay, so here we go. Got a couple things going on. First off, this is amplitude. So we know that that's going to be the absolute value of the number in front. So if I look in front of sine, I'm going to put a 1 there because it's not there. So then that's 1. So that means from your midline to your high value and your midline to your low value, that will be 1 unit going up. The period of the graph, you can see a degree here, which means we're in degrees. So I'm going to do 360 and then divide it by that value that's in front. And I see a value right there of 2. So then this graph's going to repeat every 180 degrees. Vertical shift, I don't have anything outside. I don't have, plus 1. You could say plus 0 if you want to. So on this part, you could say none or just 0. That's fine. But that means that your midline is now going to be right here. So your midline is going to be on your theta axis. Remember, if that's like a plus 2, then that would move everything up 2. So your midline would be at that plus 2. And now I have a phase shift. So I do have a phase shift because I have a C value here that we need to work out. So as we just talked about, that's going to be a negative C over our B value. So here's my C. So I'll have the opposite of that. So the opposite of a 180 is a negative 180. And then I have that value of 2, so I divide that by 2. And so then that gives me negative 90. So this thing is starting at negative 90. And so you're going to kind of see me. I have that over here. That's what that's going to tell me. This guy's going to start at negative 90 degrees. Now, to see when we're going to stop, I have to take my my starting value, and you're going to add to that whatever your period is. So I take that, and I'm going to add whatever my period of my function is, which in this case is 180. So that's for us how we're going to graph one cycle. We started where our phase shift tells us to, or if you don't have a phase shift, that means you're going to start right there at 0. But in this case, then I'm going to add my period. That's what we were doing before. We started at 0, and then we added the period, and that would told us what end. Now here, we're not starting at 0 anymore necessarily. So that gives me this. And so that tells me that this is going to end at positive 90. So I'm starting at negative 90, and I'm ending at positive 90. So starting at a negative 90, which is off here to the left. And then I know I'm going to end at positive 90. We also talked about how our amplitude was 1. Remember your midline. These are where those values are. And then we know that we're just simply going to be able to go up 1. So I know I'm just going to go up 1 here, and then I'm going to go down 1. If there was a phase shift, that would adjust that too. And for me, I like to draw these little lines going this way and that way, just to kind of know where everything's at. It's just a little bit easier to be able to do that. So for me, that's what we'll do. So now that I have that, I got to find these values. So remember, to ever find out what the different dash marks is, we always go halfway. So I need to go halfway between negative 90 and positive 90. So if you're ever unsure, you add them up, then you divide them by 2. Well, if I add up negative 90 and positive 90, I get 0 degrees. 0 degrees divided by 2, that's just 0. So then right there is halfway at 0 degrees. So go halfway between your starting and ending point, which is what we've done before, but now my starting point, like I said, is not 0. Okay, what's halfway between negative 90 and 0? That would be negative 45. So again, you could do negative 90 plus 0. That's negative 90. Divide that by 2. I get negative 45. And then that, of course, would make this to be a positive 45. Because I'm doing positive 90 plus 0 is 90. 90 divided by 2 gives you 45. So now I just have to graph it. So sine graph. A sine graph, we're starting at negative 90, but a sine graph starts at its midline. So this thing's going to start here. It's a positive sine graph, so I'm going to go up with the first dash mark, then hit the midline, then the next dash mark goes down, and then I'm back up there. And so whenever I go ahead and sketch that as best we can to some curved value, looks something like that. So just throwing in a new thing there. So if you're not well versed in the other, amplitude and period and vertical shift, then this obviously is going to be a little bit more complicated. All right, here we go again. Amplitude. In this case, there's a negative 2. So the absolute value here of that would be a positive 2. So from your midline to the high value and the midline to the low value gives you that. Notice that we're going to get here in a second, but notice that since we don't have a vertical shift, that means we're going to start my midline and go up 2 and then go down 2. The period of my function, there's this in degrees again. So that's 360. And we're going to divide that by whatever number's in front of here, which is a 1. So then this graph's going to repeat every 360 degrees. Vertical shift, we don't have one over there, so we'll just say none. Phase shift. I do have phase shift because of this, and just a reminder, that was negative C over B. So some people say, I put a negative and then put whatever the value is. So in this case, I have this negative 90 here, so I'm doing the opposite of a negative 90. So, or what we like to always say is minus from there and then a negative 90. And that's divided by 1. And so then that comes out. If I do minus and negative, that turns into a positive. So this is starting at positive 90 degrees. Positive 90 degrees. And then divide that by 1, and that's going to still be 90. So my phase shift is my starting value. So this thing's going to start at 90 degrees. And I can kind of adjust this a little bit by moving this guy a little bit that way. That's what we're probably going to have to do here. And so this thing's going to start at 90 degrees. So somewhere over here, start at 90 degrees. Now to find out where it ends, I have to take that 90 degrees as we talked about, and I'm going to add to it what the period is. Like that. And so that gives me 450. So this thing is starting over here somewhere at 90. We'll do our best to try to make it look as nice as we can. And it's ending over here at 450. So then we're going to have to go halfway. Now remember, we always said that our midline, since I don't have a vertical shift, then my midline is going to be right there. Then I've got to go, though, up 2 and then down 2 from that. And so that's going to put those up here. And you don't have to have these dashed lines there. I just think it's easier if you do. It kind of constrains it, but there's plenty of people that I've taught that have not done that, which is perfectly fine. So got that. Now I got to start going halfway again. So halfway between a 90 and a 450. So if you're unsure about this, as we talked about, you can always say, well, let me add them up. So 90 plus 450, and then divide them by 2. So then that's going to give you 540 divided by 2, and that gives you 270. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm just adding those guys up. So this would be 270 right there in the middle. And some people can look at a unit circle and be able to figure out what's going on with these if you really wanted to. You don't necessarily have to, but that's just something to kind of talk about. If you feel like you need to do that, feel free to do so. And worth mentioning that can be, if you look in, hey, look on a unit circle, what's halfway between it, that's 100% fine. But if you're not sure, 90 and 270, you can always add them up. So if I go over here, okay, what's halfway between that? Well, 90 plus 270, that gives you 360. And remember, we're dividing that by 2, and that gives you 180. So then up here, this will be 180. Give myself a little space. And you can kind of see these are going up by 90 degrees, and that's not always going to be the case, so you have to be careful. And then this one, the same kind of thing is going to be 360. So if you're not sure about that, again, you can certainly take, okay, what's halfway between it, and do 270 plus 450. Divide that by 2. That gives you 720. Divide that by 2, and that gives you that 360. So I'm just averaging to find out what these values are. All along we've been averaging. So that's 360. And then this is a negative cosine graph. A negative cosine graph, so I go here my first dash mark, because that's my starting point. Starting point's 90. I go down at the negative amplitude per se, so like the low value. And then it crosses, and then it goes up to the top, and then it crosses, and it goes back to the bottom. A positive cosine graph would start up at the positive amplitude, if you want to kind of call it that way. And then we just have to connect it after we've done that. Not my best work, but a curved value like this. Hopefully your pencil graph looks a lot better than mine. I'm using a mouse here. So again, kind of curved here, hitting these points, going down and going that way. All right, one more. So amplitude, this is going to give me the absolute value of 2 now. That's 2. And my period of my function, looks like I made one little typo here. We're going to add over to this side here. I'm going to add something that we should have done there. I'm going to say +1 here. So we are going to have that, so we can see that. So that's going to be a 2, but we are, and we'll talk about this in a second, with that because you do have a vertical shift, and sometimes people do this at the same time, this means that this graph's going to be going up 1. So I'm just going to give myself a little bit more room over here. But this one is going to be going up 1. That's my midline. So my midline is going to be right there because of this +1. Which means then that if I want to find these, I need to go from that and go up and down 2, because that's my amplitude. So up, that was going to give me 3, and then go down 1, 2. That would give me a -1. So then I still have these guys too. So these are my high and low values there and there. So that's kind of how you do it, and that's what we talked about last week on that last video. And so here, my period of my function, this is, you can see that this is a pi, so I have to say 2 pi. So I've got 2 pi. Divided by any number in front of this. We can see that that would be a 1, so this would be 2 pi divided by 1. And then that would be just 2 pi. So it's repeating every 2 pi. Did my vertical shift, my phase shift, I do have a phase shift. So a reminder that this is negative c over b. So it's minus and then negative pi over 2. And then over b value, we said our b value here is 1. So this ends up being a positive pi over 2. Divided by 1, which is just pi over 2. So this thing's starting over here at pi over 2, a positive pi over 2. So that's my starting point, pi over 2. My ending point is pi over 2 plus whatever the period is. My period was 2 pi, so I've got that. Now this isn't as easy because you got to get a common denominator. So again, fractional help here. Got to get a common denominator. Multiply that by 2 over 2. So then I get pi over 2 plus 4 pi over 2. And so then that's 5 pi over 2. So this thing's going to end somewhere over here at 5 pi over 2. So now I have to decide and what's in the middle here. So I have to kind of go halfway again. So add them up, divide. So I need to say, well, what's halfway between it? So I'm going to add this pi over 2 plus this 5 pi over 2. And then that's divided by 2. Some people add them up and forget to divide by 2, especially since you see these. And that's a little confusing. So this would give you 6 pi over 2 divided by 2. Now, we talked about before how you're essentially multiplying these guys, and you can. That would give you 6 pi over 4, but then you're still going to have to reduce that. So you can do that if you want to, as we talked about before. That's one way to do it. I can multiply those, and so that would give you 6 pi over 4, but that's really 3 pi over 2. And so then that would be 3 pi over 2. If you divided those, that would 6 divided by 2 is 3, so you'd have 3 pi divided by this 2, and you still get that same answer. Okay, now I need to go halfway here, and I need to go halfway here. So halfway between pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. So pi over 2 plus 3 pi over 2. And then again, divide that whole thing by 2. That's the average. You're dividing everything by 2 because you're averaging out two values. So then this would give you 4 pi over 2 divided by 2, which is going to give us that 4 pi over 4, because we talked about we're kind of multiplying those 2's on the bottom. When I do that, those are obviously going to cancel out and just leave you with a pi. So then up here, this value gives you pi. Last one. These can be tedious with these ones, I understand. So halfway between 3 pi over 2 and 5 pi over 2. So 3 pi over 2 plus 5 pi over 2. Divide that whole thing by 2. So sometimes we like to write that out. This will give you 8 pi over 2, which is 8 pi over 4, because you're multiplying this denominator and this. And then that's, of course, is just going to give you 2 pi. And so, last thing, you've got a positive cosine. So when my starting point is right here, in this positive cosine, that first value, if it's positive, we're going to go up to the high value. Then we're going to hit the midline. Notice I did not hit my x-axis because I had a vertical shift here. And then to the low value, and then to the midline, and then to the high value. And then we try to do a better job sketching this out than I did before. A little bit better there. So it looks like that. And again, my values here are amplitude, midline, the lower value, midline, and back up to the high point there.